Hello, gang, and welcome back to the channel that dives into the fascinating world of cryptids and the unexplained. Tattoo Biker here with you, and tonight I have 4 compelling reports of Bigfoot sightings and encounters sent in by viewers. From upstate New York to the jungles of Vietnam and even Camp Lejeune. These stories are both fascinating and intriguing enough to make you question what really lurks out there in those woods. So grab your gear and let's ride. Number 1. Hey biker, I wanted to share something that happened about 6 years ago. It all lasted no more than 5 seconds, but it's etched into my memory. Uneventful, but very real and spectacular at the same time. I haven't really told anybody yet. I just never felt like I should bring it up, and it was meant just for me. It was August 2018 at 6:10 a.m. in upstate New York in the Adirondacks area. I often left bread, nuts, fruit, and vegetable scraps thrown out into the yard. I enjoyed watching the birds, squirrels, chipmunks, rabbits, deer, fox, ravens, and crows eat the food that I fed them. I could sit out there with my morning coffee, and the critters didn't mind me being there. I would talk and pretend that I was conversing with them. This went on for months. I would sit there in the yard as the sun would go down, another animal feeding time. Sometimes I would go out late and very late for a smoke. Again, I would walk around in silence, listening and enjoying the nature. A remote and wooded area, the woods, if you will. Sounds like I'm rambling, but I'm setting the scene and my pattern of behavior. Not uncommon for me to be there day or night. So one morning, I go out the back door for coffee and a smoke, and I'm standing at the back door, breathing in the fresh morning air, and I take a sip of coffee. Nothing seems out of the ordinary. Birds chirping and critters moving about. Then I hear a snort, like a deer might do. I look exactly where it came from, maybe 100 or less feet away. The woods have this morning light shining out of the trees, but beyond that, it was still mostly dark. I could see about 20 feet into the tree line. I don't see a deer. Within 2 seconds of the first snort, I heard another one, as I'm still looking but not seeing that deer. Then something steps out from behind a tree. Its left side is facing me, and all I could see was a large, black shape step out. It stands there for a few seconds. I know what I was looking at, but I had no reaction other than just watching. It made a noise, but not the snorting kind. And then it walked into the woods. Not only did I see and hear it walk away, but I could actually feel it in the ground, like it was hollow and vibrated. No breaking or snapping of branches, just footsteps, almost like an echo in the ground itself. After about 6 steps, it was just gone. Nothing changed. Same birds and critters moving about, unaffected it seemed. I stood there processing what had just happened over the last few seconds. Other than the echoing thuds of footsteps, it was silent. When I realized that, I walked forward, slowly, out of the spot, not sure what I might see. Nothing. Where it was standing, the ground was covered with fallen and old branches. You nor I, not even a ninja, could have walked through there silently. I judged the height at an easy 8 feet tall, based on its head height relative to the tree that it stood next to. I stood there, looking around with no sounds. I walked back to the picnic table and sat on it. Still, everything was normal. After the coffee and smoke and observing the wildlife, I go ahead and head inside. As I reach for the doorknob, I feel like I should turn around, so I do and scan the tree line again. Nothing. Just as I turn the knob while facing the door, I see a flash of blue light like a camera flash, like someone behind me just took a picture. Instantly, I got goosebumps. My hair stood right up and I felt like I couldn't get inside quick enough. Strange, but uneventful and very memorable. It had to have watched me for at least 10 seconds before it moved. I haven't seen it since, but it wanted me to know it was there. P.S. This thing was absolutely massive. Thanks. Signed, Jeffrey. Number 2. Dear Biker, I've wanted to write to you for a while. I thought you'd find this interesting. One of my great uncles was a tunnel rat with the U.S. Army during the Vietnam War. His job was going into the tunnels after they'd been cleared and setting demolition charges. Just so if the VC retook an area, they couldn't reuse the tunnels. Most folks who've been there will tell you it's one of the most dangerous jobs that you could do. He told me stories about the wild men in the jungles. They would be in the tunnels too. The VC knew of them and took a lot of steps to avoid them and warn each other when they were around. The VC used a different variety of warning systems and booby traps. The Corps would have to find them and dismantle them before demolition. He said that they would find them in areas that went deeper in the caves, where they knew there wasn't a close, logical entry or exit point. So they clearly were afraid and cautious of something other than the opposing military forces getting the drop on them. Some of these deeper cave areas were set up like native camps, with things constructed from natural materials. Clearly not military. Makes you wonder if the VC took these areas over from the Rock Apes and expanded them for military use in some places. All I clearly recall of this particular story is him talking about the native camps and the wild men. Again, these were places where the VC were cleared out, and it was their job to dismantle, destroy, or reappropriate military infrastructure. Besides the tunnels, he talked a lot of the stranger and weird things that he had seen. Besides his group being followed around by these unseen wild men, the villagers would talk about these goblin, elf-like creatures. There's a name for them in Vietnamese, but I can't recall what it is. They claimed that these things lived out near the rivers. Also, they would see strange lights and things moving across the rice fields and through the jungles while out on patrol. Just strange and supernatural and paranormal things. He never talked about actual war and fighting. He stayed pretty stoic about those things, but he loved talking about the other stuff. He wasn't prone to wild stories or exaggerated tales, just really matter of fact, this weird stuff happened. And how there's a lot in this world that we just don't understand. Unfortunately, he died a few years back, but he instilled in me a love for the weird and supernatural and inspired me not to discount the strange and unusual. Signed, Mark. Number 3. Dear TB, I grew up in the southern Appalachian Mountains, the Crab Orchard Mountains of Tennessee, to be more precise. My older brother and his best friend saw a Bigfoot in the 1960s while camping on the Obed River. No guessing about it, and I always believed him. A buddy and I, back in late January in the early 2000s, we were camping and riding ATVs, and it was staying around 8 degrees Fahrenheit that night. We were back at the camp, warming around the fire and quietly talking, when all of a sudden, I have never heard the most ear-piercing, bellowing, shrieking anywhere like this on the planet. It had the volume of an elephant. It moved around our campsite in the dark, staying out of the glow of the campfire. Jerry shined his big, head-bashing flashlight all around, and we didn't see anything, but it screamed at us another 3 times. And then we heard what sounded like a damn moose running through the woods. There aren't any moose around there, let me tell you. Jerry and I kept our handguns handy for a few more hours, talking about what had just happened. I asked him, "You know what it had to be, don't you?" And he said the words, Bigfoot. But to this day, he doesn't even like to talk about it with me. It changed his perception of what's out there, though. Before that, he was Mr. Nothing Scares Me. Now, he doesn't even go out in the boonies anywhere near as much as he did before that night. If I'm lying, I'm dying. Well, you know the saying. It's the truth. Signed, Greg. Number 4. Dear Tattooed, while I was in the Marine Corps, we would be stalked by these Bigfoot creatures at Camp Lejeune, North Carolina. It didn't matter how many of us were out there. We were armed with rifles and no ammo and or blanks during our field ops. They would pick up whatever trash or snacks that we would drop. We sometimes could see their eyes in the tree line and see random glimmers of shadows through our night optics. But you could see outlines or someone's figure. Stuff like that was used probably during the early 2000s, and they were monocular. We would hear knocks or rustling throughout our nights around Verona Loop training grounds or on Camp Lejeune. Many of us who spent time in the infantry spent about 45 to 60% of the year out in the woods, and you could always hear them at night. One night I was doing patrol ops in the woods and hills, and we decided to take a pause. It was around 3 a.m., and we were taking a nap break. It was during a war game, and I was on watch with one of my buddies. Holding security, we saw an outline in the woods, and meanwhile, we were sleep deprived, not thinking that we were seeing real things in the line until we talked to each other to confirm what we were seeing through our nods. Rocks and pebbles started being thrown at us, and we started thinking that we were about to be run up on by the opposition force. So we wake up our guys slowly, thinking we're about to be ambushed. Turns out we were just being stalked. We decided to get into defensive positions, and the rocks kept coming, thinking we were being messed with by the advisors running around and overwatching the war game. We checked on the radio if there were any nearby, and none at all. So we thought it was the opposition force. We opened up with our blanks, but as we opened up, we saw a massive creature, and then another one, about 25 to 30 meters away. The creatures knocked over a semi-thin tree, giving out a deep growl, something that would shake guys who were desensitized and not really scared by anything. When daylight finally came, we circled back to look, and we found these huge footprints. We were confused and shaken by the whole experience. After that situation, we didn't know how to explain what we had seen or experienced. That night, I became an actual believer. I was always skeptical about Bigfoot, or some creature being out in the woods. It was 5 years ago, and to this day, I struggle going into the woods. Signed, Kevin. Bonus story. Hi, TB. I had a bizarre experience when I was 18 years old. I'm 39 now, but the events that unfolded remain forever burned into my memory like they happened just yesterday. My father and I decided to make a weekend hunting trip to my family's hunting cabin. Now, this cabin is located on a 120-acre plot of land in the middle of Mark Twain National Forest out in Missouri. We loaded up on Friday morning and made the drive out there. It's extremely isolated, and the closest house is roughly 8 miles away. The cabin sits in a clearing and is surrounded by fairly dense forest on all sides. We arrived at the cabin around noon or so, and we brought everything in and gassed up the electric generator, got it hooked up, and then decided it would be a good time to figure out where we wanted to set up our deer blind and stand that we'd brought along. I decided that I'd go find a good spot for the blind, and my dad said he would go into the woods and set up the stand in a different area of the woods. I followed a small game trail through the woods for quite a ways until I found a good spot, and I spent a little time setting it up and securing it so that it would be ready to hop into the first thing in the morning. As I was finishing up, I became aware that something was watching me from the tree line, about 25 yards away. At first, it was just this uneasy feeling, hairs on the back of my neck standing up and all that. I kept catching glimpses of movement. Then I saw something peek out from behind a tree and then duck back. And then there was this loud crashing sound as it ran off in the opposite direction. It freaked me out at first, but being that I didn't get a good look, I eventually just convinced myself that it was a deer or some other wild animal. I returned to the cabin and told the story to my dad, and we both laughed about it. We made some dinner, talked a little, settled down, and went to sleep around 9 p.m. Around 1:30 or so, we awoke to this loud crashing sound. It really sounded like someone had thrown a rock onto the roof of our cabin. We both got up, sat, and listened for a while, and heard nothing but the eerie stillness of the night, occasionally interrupted by the howl of the wind. After a few minutes, we got up and armed ourselves. My dad grabbed a spotlight, and we walked outside and shined it around a bit. Seeing nothing, we eventually shrugged it off as maybe a tree branch or something had fallen onto the roof, and we went back to sleep. We got up around 5 a.m., and I went to the deer blind, and my dad went to the stand that he had set up. I stayed until around 8 a.m. without any incident. That evening, I decided I would go to the deer stand and my dad could try out the blind. We explained to each other where we had set up, and we headed off. My dad had set the stand up on this edge of a small field, next to a stream about a 20-minute walk away. I opted to leave the four-wheeler, as I didn't want to scare away any potential game. I eventually found the stand, climbed up, and settled in. I'd been sitting there a while and hadn't seen anything other than a few rabbits and a ton of squirrel. The sun was starting to set, and I was about ready to hit the trail back to the cabin before the dark set in. The sun was far enough down that the woods were getting semi-dark and pretty eerie, making odd silhouettes at the shadow's edge. As I was contemplating climbing down, I heard a rustle coming from the brush over to my right. I looked over, hoping for a big buck, but immediately froze in fear. Standing no more than 25 feet from me was this huge, upright creature, covered in dark hair, staring right at me. Its face looked so eerily human, but this thing was no human. It had an odor of old coffee grounds or garbage or something. It was roughly 7 feet tall, huge and massive. I can't even emphasize enough the size of this thing. It could have easily ripped me in half without even breaking a sweat. The deer stand was about 9 feet up, and it could have just walked up and yanked me out of it. I was completely terrified. It turned and walked off into some thick brush, and I lost sight of it. Taking my chance, I hopped out of the stand and made haste back towards the cabin. As I was walking, I was completely freaked out and scared to death. My heart was beating so hard that I could actually feel it in my head. I was starting to calm a bit as I thought it had gone off in another direction when I hear a limb break. It wasn't too far behind me, off the path into the brush at the shadow's edge. And then I heard more rustling. It was following me. I started running, and I heard it keeping pace, just out of sight in the darkness of the woods. I was really regretting not bringing that four-wheeler. I heard it getting closer and closer. I panicked, and against my better judgment and a decision I would immediately regret, I turned and fired a shot in the direction of the noise, thinking maybe I could scare it off. Then it started screaming, loudly and unlike anything that I've ever heard before or since. The sound alone made my heart skip like 10 beats. I just turned and started sprinting as fast as I could. It was screaming, and it sounded like it was knocking down trees as it was coming after me. I heard it come out and cross the trail and go into the woods on the other side, still gaining on me, screaming and wailing horribly the whole time. I never once turned around to look. It sounded like this thing was close enough to grab me, and I was certain that it would catch up to me and rip me to shreds before I ever made it to the cabin. My heart was beating out of my chest in complete and utter panic. Then I heard the sound of the four-wheeler. I just kept running, and this thing was behind me, screaming and wailing the most awful noise I've ever heard while bashing through the woods. I was still in full sprint, and I could hear the four-wheeler at top gear heading my direction. Just as I was certain this thing was going to grab me, my dad appeared on the four-wheeler, and he looked just as freaked out as me. I jumped on the back, and we hauled ass back to the cabin. The whole time I could hear it screaming behind us. I never looked back. Thanks for reading. Signed, Anonymous. And there it is, gang. 5 spine-tingling encounters with Bigfoot that will leave you wondering about the mysteries surrounding us. Have you ever had your own encounter with this elusive cryptid? If you want to share your story, just send it to the email address in the description, and your encounter may end up in a future video. Oh, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more unexplained and cryptid content. Thanks for watching. And until next time, stay curious, stay vigilant, stay safe, and I'll be seeing you on down the road a ways. Biker out.